let's get into this theory of evolution by Darwin. So the theory of evolution was fully described by Darwin about, again, 150, almost 160 years ago now. And the wonderful thing about this concept is it makes sense of literally everything we know about living organisms. And the little picture I have down here just shows, in one little picture, some of the basic concepts of how natural selection works to modify organisms over time. In other words, how to drive evolution, how it drives evolution. So we have a theoretical little habitat. The resource food, which is important for survival, is at a high level on these trees, right? Resources up here. Different organisms in a population, different members of a population. So the same species, but different members in the species have variation. If you think of us, some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are stronger, some of us are weaker, hair color, skin color, hair texture, all that variation that exists in a population may favor certain individuals, and we're talking about natural habitats, and may be a disadvantage for others. So over long periods of time, we're talking generations, hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of years, the organisms change to fit their environment. They adapt over evolutionary time, and that's evolution. So in this theoretical little diagram, a population of organisms will adapt, change based on their environmental pressures or stresses in order to survive and to be well adapted to that particular habitat. So you'll see a change over time in a population of organisms. That change over time is called evolutionary adaptation, or just evolution. All right? And over a great span of time, it could lead to the appearance of different new species versus the parental species. And that is the appearance of new species, something that's called speciation that we'll talk about later on. So life evolves. It changes over time. Each species that's alive today or that was alive in the past, thinking about everything that's alive as a branching tree type structure. If we think of a branching tree, right, at the end of every branch, you might think of a leaf on a branching tree. At the end of every little branch or twig, there's a living organism, a living species. And the way the branching works is if you go towards the base of the tree, the branching evolutionary tree here, something called a phylogeny, we'll get to that later on, and all these details, indicates the relationships. So we are here, we're animals. We are, relatively speaking, closely related to fungi, or the other way to think about it is we're more closely related to fungi, fungus, than we are to ciliates, which are a type of protists. And we're more closely related to those things than we are to, say, another type of protist, right? Or if we go down this way, we're more closely related to these organisms than we are to simple single-celled archaea. And we are more closely related to, say, the archaea than we are to, notice we're going back towards the main branch of the tree here, which means back in evolutionary time. We're most distantly related to the bacteria. So these three things, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, if you remember, those are the three domains of life. And this type of branching evolutionary tree was early, this is an early example of it, and this is actually a sketch of Darwin's first little branching type tree of life, and at the ends of all the branches are living organisms. In other words, living representatives of species that are alive today. And we'll look at other phylogenies or phylogenetic trees of life that do indicate extinct species, things that have gone extinct in the past. So, for example, the ancestor to bears led to currently living giant panda bear, and then also the speckled bear. And then if we follow the evolutionary branch, so the way this works is to the left is further distance in the past, and as we go to the right is a more recent time, and this particular phylogenetic tree, these are the living representatives today. Okay, so this shows you that a sloth bear is distantly related to these organisms. The sun bear is somewhat closely related to the American black bear and the Asian black bear, right? But more distantly related to, because they're common ancestors back here, to the polar bear and the brown bear. So this shows that the polar bear and the brown bear are relatively closely related. And notice the branching event here. The common ancestor to the polar and the brown bear are here. And notice this doesn't go all that far back to the left, which means that's not too far back in the distant past. This might be, I don't know, 5 million years ago. But if that was 5 million years ago, the common ancestor to the polar bear and the brown bear, look here. This is more distantly in the past. The common ancestor to the American black bear and the Asiatic black bear is further in the past. Okay? But all these guys, all the way to the sun bear, their common ancestor is way back here. Right? And we'll look at these type of evolutionary phylogenetic trees as we go through the course. Right? But it's just showing you the evolutionary history of these bears. Now, the giant panda bear is most distantly related to the other ones. Okay? And the other way of looking at this is the polar bear and the brown bear are the most closely related and most recently evolved. In the sense of, if we go back to this point in time, there's one common ancestor, one species. There was an evolutionary speciation event that led to the polar bear and the brown bear. Okay? And again, we'll cover this in more detail later on. So Darwin's earth-shattering book, in a way, is a very significant, extremely important contribution to science. In book form was his publication in 1859, just before the start of the American Civil War, on the origin of species by means of natural selection. So, two main points that Darwin formulated. One is that the species that are alive today, like this dolphin, is a ancestor. It has ancestors in the distant past, and those ancestors were different species, and those different species changed, adapted to their environment, evolved over time to lead to the current species that are around today. So the living species today descended from an ancestral species through succession, through changes over time, adaptations to the environment. So these changes over time, he referred to them as descent with modification. Descent meaning ancestral species, their ancestors changed somewhat, their ancestors changed somewhat, their descendants, changed, their descendants, their offspring changed, and those changes built up to the point where a new species appeared, and another new species appeared, etc., etc., etc. The modification is the change over time. Okay? So that's capturing the duality of life. Unity and diversity. So the unity, we talked about this a little while ago. Life has unity and life has diversity. All living things on planet Earth have unity in the sense of the genetic material, their growth and development, they are cellular, the way they have to harness, process energy somehow, obtain energy. We all have genetic material, DNA, so we are linked together with everything else that's alive on Earth, and that's the unity part. And in terms of our ancestors, we're linked to them because we evolved from the common ancestor, if you go back far enough. In other words, all the living whales today evolved from a common ancestor, which, by the way, look at the legs, happen to be terrestrial, lived on land. Okay? The diversity part of life is very diverse, a lot of species on planet Earth, is because the ancestors, as they evolved over time, speciated, new species arose. So that's the diversity part. right? The descent with modification led to, and is still occurring, appearance of new species, speciation. And again, we'll talk about these things when we get into the evolutionary chapters, or the evolution chapters. What's causing this change? Natural selection. That is the mechanism that pushes, drives, that generates change in populations, modification, and as those modifications, changes build and build and build, it leads to new species. So that was his two main points, right? Descent with modification. And what's pushing that descent? Natural selection. Good choice of words, because it's natural environment that is selecting for certain characteristics. Remember that little diagram I showed you that are beneficial to certain organisms, because within populations there's variation that natural selection acts upon. And again, we'll cover this in more detail when we do the evolution chapters. Oh, there's a little diagram again. So in life, there's a struggle for existence. Resources are limited, sometimes severely limited. And those individuals with heritable traits that allow them to survive in environments are more likely to survive in the environment, have more offspring, reach adulthood, have more offspring. Not all of their offspring would be tall, like in this example, but some of them will. Think of you. If you come from a tall family, not everyone is really tall. Some people are a little shorter. Some people might be average height, but maybe more of you guys are tall. In this example, the taller ones survive more so, right? A higher percentage of them survive, and a higher percentage of them have offspring. So over evolutionary time, the increased appearance of that characteristic, in this case height, becomes more and more common. Okay, so the traits, think of height, they're best suited for local environments. Those organisms that have those traits more likely to survive, and they'll more likely to leave a higher number of offspring. They'll have more babies because more of them survive. Okay? So the environment is selecting the particular traits that are beneficial and that get passed on to the offspring. That's the natural selection part of what's driving this modification, descent with modification in organisms. So the product of natural selection is adaptation, the accumulation of variations or characteristics or traits in populations over time, and long time. Generational time? No. Geologic time. Thousands and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. A classic example are Darwin's finches, or the finches in the Galapagos Islands. When Darwin looked at the Galapagos Islands and visited, he collected lots of birds, and he realized that they had certain similarities, and they were modifications, adaptations, evolutionary change adaptations. In other words, the finches that were on the Galapagos Islands, and they're still there, he surmised correctly that they evolved through descent with modification, natural selection acting on variation on an ancestral species that arrived on the islands and speciated to generate the different 13 different finch species on the islands. Another example, antibiotic resistance in bacteria evolves in response to the overuse of antibiotics, which happens in human medicine, but also in the cattle industry, for example, and in agriculture to a great extent, like dairy and cattle farms. What happens is farmers will give their cattle antibiotics to combat disease, even if the animals are not sick. So it's a preventative measure. But what happens is the antibiotics work really well at destroying the bacteria, killing the bacteria that they're supposed to kill. But through changes, adaptations, usually mutations, some bacteria might be antibiotic resistant. So the antibiotics kill most of the other bacteria, but the ones that survive that are resistant will reproduce, and eventually you'll have a greater number of antibiotic resistant bacteria living in the cattle. So the agricultural response, the farmer response, is to add more antibiotics.